won't tolerate a fake what I made up. Your story, if you like to where you're taking chances. She's paranormal, searching for the truth. Is it a man in a mask who knows for a demon? What is it like? What is the reason? She is paranormal.
Being buried alive. Yes, it did happen. Yes, it has happened recently. And can we ever 100% be positive it won't ever happen again? No. However, over the course of the last few hundred years, certain steps have been developed in order to assure people that this won't happen again. Being buried alive ranks pretty high on the list of terrible ways to die. In the early days of medicine, it was much more difficult to determine if someone was actually dead or if they were just in a coma. Were they paralysed? Were they weak from fever? Either way, due to a high instance of people waking on the verge of being buried, the medical field in the mid-18th century started to devise methods to ensure that the person was actually deceased. Some of them were rather barbaric in nature, and some not so much. The more benign of the ways of finding out if someone was dead or not were things like pinching, scratching the skin with prickle bushes, shaking, shouting in their ear, putting a mirror under their nose to see if any mist formed on the mirror. Then we move to the more horrendous of methods. They would cut the skin, pierce the heart, and one of the more horrifying methods was to take a hot poker and insert it into the rectum of the corpse. They also used a rather interesting and amusing method of resuscitating the corpse. That was to blow smoke up the bottom of the deceased person. However, that method was actually used for other things properly back in the 18th century. For example, if you had a tummy ache, some kind of stomach ailment, an illness, they would use that method to assist in your healing. Eventually, the stethoscope was invented in 1816 by a Frenchman, René Laennec. It wasn't used as he would have liked at that time to decipher if someone was alive or dead. It was new, so therefore poo-pooed by a lot of people. Eventually, however, later on in the 19th century, it was used to assist in determining if someone had actually died. The Germans in the later part of the 19th century came up with the idea of what they called dead houses, or a waiting house, a mortuary that was built with the purpose of placing bodies inside it, laying them out for a number of days until it was absolutely determined that they were dead, and that was generally by putrefaction, so when the bodies started to decay. There were many famous, well-known people that over the years were petrified of being buried alive. George Washington, his final words, "I am just going. Have me decently buried and do not let my body be put into the vault in less than 3 days after I am dead." Now, Tobias, his secretary, lived up to that. They did that. They kept him for 3 days, then they put him into the vault. Chopin. It is said that he died from TB, tuberculosis, and a note that was found with him after he passed away. "The earth is suffocating. Swear to make them cut me open so I won't be buried alive." And then we have Alfred Nobel, for which the Nobel Prize is named after. He was the same. "It is my express wish that following my death my veins shall be opened, and when this has been done and competent doctors have confirmed clear signs of my death, my remains shall be cremated in a so-called crematorium. Tapophobia is the real fear of being buried alive. People still have that fear now, more so obviously back in the days where it was a true possibility. The fear of being buried alive led to a lot of different people inventing different ways to improve the coffin, improve the burial process, so that if you were buried in your coffin alive, there were safety measures that would hopefully alert people to the fact and they could dig you back up. One such invention was that of a Mr. Franz Vester. He called it the improved burial case. The tomb is equipped with a number of features including an air outlet, a ladder and a bell, so that the person, upon waking, could save himself. If too weak to ascend by the ladder, he can ring the bell, give the desired alarm for help, and thus save himself from premature death by being buried alive. So the patent explains. A gentleman named John Krikenbaum invented what he called a device for indicating life in buried persons. Crikey, you'd need muscles and strength if you actually woke up in the coffin for this one. It had a T-bar, which the deceased person's hands would be placed on when they're put into the coffin. And should they wake up, they turn handles on the T-bar, which make air move within the device, thus indicating that there is movement in the coffin and also supplying air to the deceased. Gosh, good luck with that one. In 1885, Charles Seiler and Frederick Borntrager came up with the invention of a burial casket. The invention provides for improvements in the important components of the previous buried alive inventions. In this instance, the body could trigger a clockwork-driven fan, which will force fresh, breathable air into the coffin. The device also included a battery-powered alarm. According to the patent, when the hand is moved, the exposed part of the wire will come into contact with the body, completing the circuit between the alarm and the ground to the body in the coffin. The alarm will sound. There is also a spring-loaded rod which will raise up, carrying feathers or other signals. Additionally, a tube is positioned over the face of the buried body so that a lamp may be introduced down the tube and the person looking down through the tube can see the face of the body in the coffin. One of the other inventions was a spring-loaded coffin lid. Theory is you're buried alive, you wake up, you move. That triggers the spring-loaded coffin lid to open and ta-da, you're free. That probably works in theory, maybe, if you're in a vault or a tomb, but if you're under 6 foot of dirt, good luck. Another one that was interesting was the Morse code device. So the corpse would be buried with a Morse code device in their hand. So should they wake up, there you go, use Morse code and communicate with the living and we'll come and dig you up. We even have a whistle. That's right, a whistle. The tubing is placed upon the mouth of the deceased. So should they awake and find themselves alive in the coffin, they simply blow and the whistle will alert those around that you are indeed still alive and they'll come and rescue you. Of course, there's the old tried and tested, which is the original bell on a string. Attached to your finger within the coffin, goes up a pole outside, and should you wake up and move your hand, the bell will ring and alert those around that you're still alive. Of course, now as medicine's advanced, technology advances in determining if someone's alive or dead. Doctors can hook a body up to machines that monitor heartbeat, brainwaves, respiration. But even though the fad of coffin alarms has long passed, there are some interesting 21st century innovations in connecting with the dead. This is a 2010 invention, okay? An apparatus and method for generating post-burial audio communications in the burial casket. Yep, that's right. In this instance, the casket has an audio message system containing audio and music files that are automatically played in accordance with the program's schedule, thereby allowing the living to communicate with the deceased. The system also allows for wireless updating of the recorded files, giving surviving family members the ability to update, revise, and edit stored audio files and programming after burial. Then we have another one in 2015, Your Music for Eternity Systems. Basically, the system comprises a solar-powered digital music player which allows both the living as well as the dearly departed to be comforted by music or a recorded message. There is a speaker in the casket and a headset jack on the headstone. This is the first of many horrific stories that I came across in my research. This particular one was a milkwoman's daughter. The young lass was laid out for burial. Family and friends were gathered and all questioned whether or not she was actually dead. They thought she looked rather well, so somebody took a looking glass, placed it under her nose. They gathered that she still had breath in her, but the mother, to quote the article, the mother mocked and reviled them and swore that she should be buried. And so she was. But it came to the ears of a near relation that she had been buried when people thought she may well still be alive. He got the grave dug up, the coffin opened. She was then found with her knees drawn up and unfortunately her hands, to quote the article, bitten to pieces, struggling for life. A surgeon was sent for to bleed her, but it was then too late. So there was a story I fell across which was published in 1836 in a New York newspaper. However, it's an Irish story. And here the story goes is that in 1768, a young married lady named Hardman had an epileptic fit. She passed away. Well, at least the physician that came to the house to look at her and determine what was wrong said she was dead. She had no pulse, and when he held the mirror under her nose, there was no breath. So she was taken away to the funeral home, and arrangements were made, and she was placed inside the family vault. Now, the interesting thing is, this was a well-off family. Mrs. Hardman was wearing a rather large diamond ring. Most of the staff of the Hardman house knew that she had this ring, but in particular the butler knew that she was wearing this ring, and he knew it had not been removed. The reason it hadn't been removed was that her finger, it was just too hard to get off. You would have to have cut her finger off to get the ring off. The husband didn't want to do that. He said, no, it's not important. Just bury my wife. Now, the butler took it upon himself that once she was in the vault, opened the coffin, took Mrs. Hardman's hand and cut the finger. But what he didn't expect was when he did that, a big gush of blood came out. It went into his face. The lady in the coffin, Mrs. Hardman, started up and screamed, "Oh, I am murdered! Help! Help!" So the butler, in a panic of horror, ran off without taking his light. He'd left a lantern behind, so he just ran. Mrs. Hardman, she wrapped herself up as decently as she could, hurried out of the tomb, and she ran all the way home. She rapped violently twice on the door. Her husband opened it. Obviously, he had a fright. But she said, "Oh, Henry, I live. Tell me, what is the cause of all this? Why have I been entombed alive?" So anyway, the story goes that Mr. Hardman and his wife didn't do anything to the butler. So there you have it. The story of being buried alive with a happy ending. So here's another one, 1845. A young lady in Baltimore had taken sick. She died suddenly. Physician said she was dead, so in the vault she was placed. A few days after, when the family visited the vault, they were struck by the horrible sight of the young lady in her burial clothing out of the coffin and sitting up against the side of the wall, dead. Obviously, the family was distraught, as were all of the friends. The coffin lid had been forcibly pressed off by the young woman who had actually been buried before the vital spark had fled, and who had returned to consciousness but only to die the most horrible of deaths. So here's another one with, thankfully, a happy ending. 1849. Mr. Schneider came very close to being buried alive. It seems that he was seized with cholera, obviously gone into some kind of comatose state. He was deemed dead, and his body was at once transferred to a coffin and hurried off to the graveyard. On reaching the cemetery, and just as the coffin was on the eve of being lowered into the ground, a knocking was heard from the inside, which caused those around the grave to stop and listen. They removed the lid. Upon this being accomplished, Mr. Schneider was discovered to be alive and, of course, taken home. The newspaper of the time in the article said this should act as a warning to persons not to be so rapid in committing the bodies of their friends to the grave after death is supposed to have intervened. We fear that this is not the only instance of the kind that has transpired since the epidemic has been raging in our midst. So this is a story that's, it's a big one, but it's interesting. There was a young lady that was ill and supposedly died. The family wanted to bury her. They wanted to have it done and dusted. But the doctor said, look, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I can't find a pulse. Everything I do, nothing's showing me she's still alive, but there's something about her presentation and the fact that she is still warm. I'm just not sure. So she laid for 3 days in her coffin in the family home, in the parlour. Finally, this doctor said, look, I'm just going to get a colleague to come and have a look at her to be sure. When he laid his ear upon her chest, he couldn't feel a pulse either, but when he laid her ear on her chest, he was confident that he could hear the slightest heartbeat. So because the doctor was certain he could hear a heartbeat, to quote the article, I then did not hesitate a moment to apply the proper remedies. So if you can imagine, at that moment he applied the proper remedies and the young lady woke up. She screamed. Everybody in the room that was there screamed and ran. But the young lady indeed was not dead. Okay, so this is the story of Alice Blunden. Her husband was a rather wealthy malt salesman. He wasn't at home when this happened. He was off in the next village, I believe, selling his wares, doing some business deals. Alice would drink poppy water to fall asleep. And I guess she drank a little bit too much poppy water on this one day, and the family came in and, oh my God, she's dead. The physician was called. He held the mirror under her nose, the usual things. Yep, she's dead. Well, she was a largish lady, and it was warm weather for that time of the year. So the family said, look, we've got to get her into the ground as quickly as we possibly can because this is just going to be a disaster. The physician agreed. The husband was notified somehow, and he said, look, just wait until I get home before you bury her, but the family didn't wait. So long story short, poor old Alice was, being a large lady, they would have had to have made a coffin specific for her, but they didn't have time, you see. So they got a coffin that was already made. It was too small for her, and the poor woman was just squished and manhandled with poles and whatnot to get her into this coffin. She was taken along to the graveyard and buried. The next day, some kids were playing in the churchyard, and they heard muffled cries from a woman coming from the burial site. So they raced to tell their school teacher. The school teacher didn't believe him. He told the boys they were naughty. They got punished. But the next day, the school teacher thought, oh, what if they weren't lying? So off he went to the graveyard. He also hears some cries coming from the ground. So he races into town to get people to come and help. But it's later on in the afternoon before they get there. They dig her up and they realise that she's still alive. But what happens is she passes out again. So what do they say? Oh, well, she's actually dead now. So when they realised that she had in fact died again, or so they thought, they buried her again, but this time they left someone there to guard the grave. Unfortunately, the fellow that had been left to guard the grave, just in case she should shout out again, he decided that it had started to rain, it was getting cold, and he was going into town to the pub. So the next day when it was found out that he had left his post, they dug the body up. And unfortunately, yes, they had found that she was dead, but only after struggling to free herself once more. The husband was quite obviously, when he arrived home, he had the family tried because he believed that they had murdered her in some respect, but the doctor or the physician that had said that she was dead spoke on their behalf, so nothing happened there. The family avoided the death penalty. And in fact, if you go to visit that town now, there's this plaque in her honour that proves the story was true. Well, after those gruesome stories, sleep well. I hope you've learned something from the episode, and I hope that some of what I've explained here alleviates your fear, if you have one, of being buried alive. Thanks for watching.